When my ex-husband, Daniel, accused me of hiding money during our divorce, I didn't react the way he expected. He wanted tears or outrage or maybe even a confession to validate the narrative he'd already written in his mind. Instead, I stared at him across the polished oak conference table, blinked twice, and let out a short, incredulous laugh. Not because it was funny, nothing about our divorce was funny, but because the accusation was so absurd it almost felt like a parody of our broken marriage. Daniel always had a flair for the dramatic. He treated every disagreement like a courtroom scene in a legal drama, complete with monologues, evidence boards, and long pauses where he waited for gasps that never came. But accusing me of siphoning money, that was new, even for him. This was a man who once lost his wallet for 3 days before discovering it had slipped under our sofa cushions. A man who used to Venmo me $40 at midnight because he forgot he promised to pay for groceries. A man who once tried to write off a flat-screen TV as a business necessity, even though his so-called business was a blog he updated twice a year. And suddenly he knew, every cent, in our accounts. Right. The kicker was that Daniel wasn't even subtle about his suspicions. He stormed into our mediator's office with a manila folder like he was holding nuclear launch codes. When he opened it dramatically, all it contained was a printed spreadsheet he had clearly made at 2 a.m. based on outdated bank statements and whatever conspiracy his sleep-deprived mind concocted. According to him, several mysterious transactions pointed to me funneling money into a secret account. In reality, the transactions were automatic withdrawals for things like car insurance, streaming services, and, ironically, his own gym membership that he hadn't used in 2 years. But logic had never been Daniel's strong suit. Pride was. And once he'd convinced himself I was hiding something, he was determined to prove it, facts be damned. I shrugged it off at first. People say all kinds of wild things during divorces. I figured he'd rant, stew, and eventually move on. But Daniel didn't move on. He escalated. Because that's what Daniel did when he felt cornered. He doubled down, even if he was wrong. Especially if he was wrong. 2 weeks later, I noticed a black sedan following me to work. I assumed I was imagining it, until I saw the same car again when I left for lunch. And again when I drove home. At one point, I made 3 unnecessary turns through my neighborhood just to test it, and sure enough, the sedan stuck to me like a loyal dog. A very suspicious, very incompetent dog. It turned out that wasn't the only car. Over the next few days, I spotted a silver SUV parked across from my apartment with the same dented bumper every morning. A man pretending to read a newspaper at the bus stop despite wearing sunglasses at dusk. A woman, shopping, in the baking aisle for 20 minutes while occasionally peeking at me between the flour bags. One investigator even followed me into a Pilates class and tried to blend in by mimicking my instructor's movements, with all the grace of a giraffe learning to ice skate. The absurdity of it all was almost impressive. At first, I was irritated. I didn't like being watched, especially not by strangers hired by the man who once claimed he loved me. But as the days went on, my irritation shifted to reluctant amusement. What exactly did Daniel think they would find? That I snuck briefcases of cash into a hidden vault beneath my office? That I met with shadowy figures in back alleys to exchange envelopes? The most scandalous thing they witnessed that week was me crying in my car over a burnt latte. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I pretended not to notice them, just to see how far they'd go. Turns out, they'd go pretty far. One investigator followed me into Target on a Tuesday night and trailed me through the aisle as I debated between 2 laundry detergents. If that was the smoking gun Daniel was looking for, he was in worse shape than I thought. But the most ridiculous moment came the following Thursday. I was at my local grocery store, walking toward the produce section, when I noticed a man in a baseball cap holding up a tomato and pretending to inspect it. I recognized him from the week before, the same guy who nearly tripped over a yoga block in Pilates. This time, he was clearly holding his phone at an angle to record me. I gave him a polite smile, then reached for a bunch of bananas. He pretended to examine a cantaloupe like it contained state secrets. Later, I learned Daniel had hired not 1, not 2, but 3 private investigators. 3. As in an entire miniature surveillance team, all dedicated to proving I was some kind of criminal mastermind. He paid them more in a single week than he had ever spent on my birthday gifts during our entire marriage. Combined, if he'd shown that level of commitment to our relationship, we might still have been married. But the irony was that I didn't even try to stop them. I wasn't hiding anything, and truthfully, letting them follow me was easier than dealing with Daniel's tantrums. If he wanted to waste thousands of dollars chasing non-existent evidence, that was his prerogative. I'd long since learned that fighting with him only made him louder. So I let the investigators trail me. Let them record me picking up dry cleaning and paying my electric bill. Let them jot down notes while I bought toothpaste and stocked up on frozen dinners. I figured it would all blow up on its own eventually. I just didn't realize how spectacularly it would blow up, or that Daniel's ridiculous mission to expose my imaginary wrongdoing would end with a discovery he never saw coming. Because while the investigators found no evidence against me, they did stumble across something else entirely. Something far more incriminating. Something Daniel had buried deep and assumed would stay hidden forever. And the best part, he was the one who hired the very people who uncovered it. Helen approached me on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the kind of day when the sky hangs low and every street feels narrower than usual. I had just finished work and ducked into a quiet cafe to escape the downpour. I was stirring honey into my tea when she appeared at my table, small, composed, and wearing a look that suggested she'd practiced this conversation several times in her mind before gathering the courage to approach me. "You don't know me," she began, "but I've been following you." My first instinct was to laugh because it wasn't exactly a revelation. At that point, I could practically sense the investigators the way birds sense weather fronts. But there was something different in her voice, not the defensiveness the others had, not the awkwardness of someone who hated their job, but a softness, almost like regret. She sat down without waiting for my invitation. I didn't ask her to leave. Something told me this wasn't a confrontation, it was a confession. "I need you to see something," she said, sliding a thick folder across the table. Her fingertips lingered on it, as if she was reluctant to let go. "What is it?" I asked, even though I already knew it wasn't the usual nonsense Daniel had been peddling. "Not what Daniel thinks," she said quietly. "Not even close." I opened the folder and froze. The pages inside were printouts of bank transfers, tax statements, flagged transactions, and something labeled as high-risk financial activity. Except the name on every page wasn't mine. It was Daniel's. For a long moment, all I could do was stare at the bold black letters at the top of the first page. Daniels and Pierce Financial Consulting, a company that hadn't existed when we were married, and certainly not one I'd heard any legitimate details about in the years since. Helen leaned in. "We found these while trying to verify the allegations he made about you. He wanted us to dig through your accounts, your history, your life. But when your records showed nothing unusual, we broadened our search." She paused. "And we found this." The word "this" carried weight, heavy and dangerous. Helen explained that during their investigation, the team stumbled on irregularities connected to Daniel's finances. Not by following me, but by tracing his payments to them, payments routed through shell accounts, funds originating from places they shouldn't have, tax forms that didn't match his reported income. It was all a tangled web he must have thought looked neat and impenetrable from his perspective. "Your ex-husband is committing fraud," she said simply. "Massive fraud." I sat there in stunned silence. My first reaction wasn't anger, it was disbelief. Daniel, who used to brag about saving a few dollars with coupons, was running a scheme involving offshore accounts and unreported income. The same man who nervously double-checked the tip line on restaurant receipts because he didn't want to accidentally overpay. That Daniel. But the evidence was right in front of me. Line after line, transfer after transfer, some amounts small enough to slip under standard review, others large enough to make me wonder how he'd gone so long without being caught. "Why are you bringing this to me?" I finally asked. "Because we're done working for him," Helen said. "And because we need a witness who can confirm these accounts aren't yours, who can testify that you had nothing to do with this." "Testify," I repeated slowly, letting the word settle between us. She nodded. "We're turning everything over to the authorities." His investigators, were turning him in. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. For weeks Daniel had been prancing around, convinced he was going to catch me in some scandal and bring it triumphantly into court, like a hunter showing off a prize. Meanwhile, the people he hired were quietly unraveling a scandal of his own creation. Helen gave me a card and stood to leave. Before she turned away, she said, "He underestimated you. And he underestimated us. That's why he's going to lose." The cafe door chimed behind her as she walked out, leaving me alone with the folder, the thick, damning collection of proof that my ex-husband had unknowingly orchestrated his own downfall. The day of the court hearing arrived with sharp morning sunlight and a kind of restless energy in the air. Daniel showed up in an expensive suit, radiating smug confidence. I could almost hear the internal soundtrack he imagined playing as he walked in, something heroic and triumphant. His lawyer carried another manila folder, his supposed evidence, no doubt still containing those outdated bank statements and wild speculation charts. He nodded at me like he was about to win an award. Then the investigators walked in. All three of them, together. Daniel's expression collapsed inch by inch. His mouth opened slightly, as though searching for words, but nothing came out. For a man who always had something to say, the silence was delicious. His lawyer turned toward him with a furrowed brow. "You didn't tell me they were coming," he whispered. Daniel couldn't respond. He was too busy staring at Helen, who offered him a polite but icy nod before handing the judge a thick binder labeled Financial Misconduct, Preliminary Findings. The judge flipped through the first pages, eyebrows rising with each one. "Mr. Pierce," the judge said slowly, "it appears the evidence submitted today pertains not to your wife's financial activity, but to yours." The courtroom became so quiet I could hear Daniel's breathing tighten. He tried to speak, but what came out was a stammering mess of excuses. Something about misunderstandings, misfiled documents, a clerical error. But the investigators were professionals. They presented everything calmly, fact by fact, like tightening a net around him. With every statement they made, the color drained further from Daniel's face. The judge turned back to him. "Why did you hire investigators to examine her accounts when it appears your own required scrutiny?" That did it. That single question snapped the last thread of Daniel's confidence. He looked at me then, eyes wide, as if silently begging me to step in, to explain something away, to save him from the consequences he never imagined he'd have to face. He finally understood the irony, that he was the architect of his own ruin. But I didn't rescue him. I simply met his gaze with a calmness I hadn't felt in months. I didn't need to say a word. He had hired private investigators to expose my lies. And instead, they exposed his truth. His fraud. His secrets. His downfall. The hearing ended with the judge ordering a full federal review of Daniel's financial practices. As we walked out, I could hear him arguing with his lawyer, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. I stepped outside into the sunlight. The air felt clearer, lighter, as if the world itself had exhaled. Daniel had tried to destroy me, and instead, he handed me my freedom wrapped in the evidence of his own crimes. It was poetic justice, delivered by the very people he trusted to bring me down.